The Great War had engulfed Europe, turning vast landscapes into barren fields of mud and wire. Trenches stretched for miles, zigzagging across the countryside, filled with soldiers who endured constant bombardment, disease, and the ever-present threat of death. The stalemate was unbroken, with each side entrenched in a brutal war of attrition. The generals needed a new strategy, a breakthrough to end the relentless cycle of bloodshed. In 1915, the seeds of innovation were sown in the mind of British engineer Ernest Swinton. The inspiration came not from the battlefield, but from the agricultural fields of England. Swinton observed how farm tractors, fitted with continuous tracks, could navigate difficult terrain with ease. If such a machine could be armored and weaponized, it might be the key to overcoming the trenches and barbed wire that had halted the war's progress. Swinton's idea was simple yet revolutionary: a vehicle that could carry its own firepower, resist enemy bullets, and traverse the no-man's land that had become a graveyard for countless soldiers. Development began in secrecy, with the project codenamed WW1 to conceal its purpose. The first prototype, named Little Willie, was a crude and ungainly machine. It was slow, prone to mechanical failures, and offered little protection to its crew. But it was a start. Engineers refined the design, eventually producing the MarkI, the world's first operational tank. This machine was far from perfect. It moved at a walking pace, its armor was thin, and it was notoriously unreliable. Yet, it represented a leap forward in the art of war. The MarkI was a formidable sight. With its caterpillar tracks and steel hull, it looked more like a land ship than a vehicle. It was armed with a pair of naval 6-pounder guns and several machine guns, capable of unleashing a torrent of firepower. Its tracks allowed it to cross trenches and crush barbed wire, while its armor provided a degree of protection against small arms fire. However, the interior was a nightmare. The engine's heat turned the cabin into an oven, and the roar of machinery made communication nearly impossible. The smell of oil and exhaust filled the air, and the crew had to endure these conditions for hours at a time. Despite these flaws, the tank was ready for its battlefield debut. In 1916, the British High Command decided to test the tank at the Battle of the Somme, a campaign that had already claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. The offensive at Flos-Courcelette was chosen as the proving ground. 32 MarkI tanks were prepared for action, each crewed by 8 men who had trained tirelessly for this moment. The soldiers who marched alongside these machines had mixed feelings. Some saw the tanks as a symbol of hope, a weapon that could turn the tide of the war. Others were skeptical, doubting their effectiveness and reliability. The enemy, however, had no idea what was coming. As dawn broke on September 15, 1916, the tanks rolled forward. Their engines roared to life, and the ground shook beneath their massive weight. For the first time in history, armored vehicles advanced toward enemy lines, their tracks grinding through mud and wire. The Germans were caught completely off guard. From their trenches, they saw towering metal monsters emerging from the morning mist. Panic spread among the ranks. Machine guns fired desperately, but the bullets pinged off the tank's armor. Barbed wire, once an insurmountable obstacle, was crushed beneath the tank's tracks. The psychological impact was immense. For the first time, the Germans felt vulnerable in their trenches. However, the tank's limitations quickly became apparent. Many broke down before reaching the front lines, their primitive engines unable to handle the rigors of combat. Others became stuck in the mud, immobile and easy targets for artillery. Of the 32 tanks deployed, only 9 made it to the German lines. But those 9 tanks achieved something remarkable. They punched holes in the enemy defenses, allowing British infantry to advance further than they had in months. The conditions inside the tanks were almost as harrowing as the battle outside. Temperatures inside the steel hulls reached unbearable levels, and the noise of the engine and gunfire was deafening. Communication was nearly impossible, forcing the crew to rely on hand signals. The air was thick with smoke and fumes, making it difficult to breathe. The men inside the tanks fought not only the enemy, but also the machine itself, struggling to keep it operational under the harshest conditions. The Battle of Flos-Courcelette marked the beginning of a new era in warfare. The tank, despite its flaws, had proven its potential to change the battlefield. It was not a decisive victory, the stalemate continued, and the war dragged on. But the tank had shown that innovation could break the deadlock of trench warfare. It was a weapon born out of necessity, forged in the fires of conflict, and destined to evolve into one of the most important tools of modern warfare. September 15, 1916, was a day that would forever change the nature of warfare. It was the first time tanks were deployed on a battlefield, and the world would never be the same. The early hours of that day saw a heavy mist hanging over the fields of Flies-Courcelette, a village that had become a stronghold for German forces during the Battle of the Somme. British soldiers, weary but resolute, prepared to launch a new offensive. Among them were 32 MarkITanks, the first of their kind, each crewed by 8 men who had trained tirelessly for this moment. For months, secrecy had surrounded these mechanical beasts, and now they were ready to prove their worth. The tanks roared to life, their engines belching smoke as they began their slow advance. Soldiers watched in awe as the machines lumbered forward, their caterpillar tracks grinding through the mud and barbed wire that had long defined the no-man's land between the opposing trenches. To the Germans, the sight was otherworldly. Emerging from the mist, the tanks appeared like iron monsters, their armor glinting dully in the pale morning light. Panic spread quickly through the German lines. Machine gun fire rattled out in desperate volleys, but the bullets ricocheted harmlessly off the tanks' steel hulls. Trenches that had once been impregnable defenses were overrun as the tanks crushed wire, traversed obstacles, and opened paths for the infantry to follow. Inside the tanks, the experience was grueling. The air was thick with fumes from the engine and the stench of oil and sweat. Temperatures soared to unbearable levels, and the deafening roar of the machinery made communication nearly impossible. Crews relied on hand signals and shouts to coordinate their movements. The confined space was suffocating, and every jolt of the tank over rough terrain threatened to knock them off their feet. Yet the men inside pushed forward, determined to fulfill their mission. Not all of the tanks reached the front lines. The Mark I, though innovative, was a prototype in every sense of the word. Many broke down before they could engage the enemy, their engines failing or tracks becoming jammed in the churned-up mud. Others were hit by artillery fire, their thin armor no match for high-explosive shells. Of the 32 tanks deployed, only 9 managed to reach the German lines. But those 9 tanks achieved what had seemed impossible just the day before. They shattered the stalemate that had gripped the battlefield for months. As the tanks advanced, they left devastation in their wake. German soldiers abandoned their positions, retreating in disarray. The psychological impact of the tanks was immense. For years, the trenches had been a place of relative safety for defenders, but the arrival of these armored behemoths shattered that illusion. The sight of a tank rolling inexorably toward them, impervious to small arms fire, was enough to break the resolve of even the most hardened troops. For the British infantry following in the tank's wake, the advance was a rare moment of progress in a war defined by stagnation. Paths cleared by the tanks allowed soldiers to move forward without becoming entangled in barbed wire or cut down by machine guns. For the first time in months, the British lines surged forward, capturing ground that had seemed untouchable. Yet the success was far from complete. The tanks' limitations were laid bare on the battlefield. Their slow speed made them vulnerable to artillery, and their mechanical reliability left much to be desired. Coordinating the movements of the tanks and infantry proved difficult, as the machines often outpaced the soldiers or veered off course. The German defenders, though shaken, quickly adapted. Artillery crews began targeting the tanks with greater precision, and anti-tank tactics were devised almost on the spot. Despite these setbacks, the first use of tanks was a clear demonstration of their potential. They had shown that the stalemate of trench warfare could be broken, that barbed wire and machine guns were no longer insurmountable obstacles. The psychological impact alone was a victory, sowing fear and confusion among the enemy. For the men inside the tanks, however, the cost of this progress was steep. They emerged from their machines exhausted, many suffering from burns, smoke inhalation, and the physical toll of operating in such harsh conditions. Some did not emerge at all, their tanks becoming their tombs. As the battle concluded, military leaders began to take stock of what had been achieved. The tanks had not been the decisive weapon some had hoped for, but they had proven that the concept was sound. Engineers and tacticians began to analyze the lessons of Fliss Courcelette, identifying the flaws that needed to be addressed. Better engines, stronger armor, and improved coordination with infantry were all deemed essential for future success. For the soldiers who had witnessed the tanks in action, the memory of that day lingered long after the war ended. The machines, with their grinding tracks and unyielding advance, had become a symbol of a new era in warfare. They were a glimpse of the future, a harbinger of the mechanized battles that would come to define the 20th century. The first tanks were imperfect, but they had paved the way for a revolution in military strategy. The terror and awe they inspired would echo through history, a testament to the power of innovation in the face of adversity. The aftermath of the first tank deployment at Fliss Courcelette was both a revelation and a wake-up call for military leaders. While the MarkITanks had shown promise, their shortcomings were impossible to ignore. Many had broken down or become stuck in the mud before even reaching the front lines. Those that did manage to engage the enemy had limited impact due to their slow speed, mechanical unreliability, and vulnerability to artillery fire. Still, they had accomplished what had once seemed unthinkable, breaking the stalemate of trench warfare and proving that the tank had potential as a revolutionary weapon. The lessons learned from that battle were invaluable. Engineers immediately began working on improving the design of the tanks. One of the most significant changes was the development of more reliable engines that could withstand the rigors of combat. Tracks were reinforced to better handle the muddy, uneven terrain of the Western Front. The armor was thickened to provide greater protection against small arms and shrapnel, though there was still little defense against heavy artillery. Internally, ventilation systems were improved to reduce the heat and fumes that had plagued tank crews during the first deployment. These upgrades led to the creation of the Mark IV, a more robust and capable machine that would play a pivotal role in future battles. Beyond the physical improvements to the tanks, military strategists began to rethink how they were used in combat. The first deployment had been hampered by poor coordination between the tanks and supporting infantry. Tanks often advanced too far ahead, leaving the soldiers behind and vulnerable to counterattacks. Communication between the tank crews and infantry was nearly impossible due to the noise and chaos of battle. To address this, new tactics were developed that emphasized combined arms operations. Tanks would no longer operate in isolation. Instead, they would work in tandem with infantry, artillery, and air support to create a cohesive and overwhelming assault. The British were not the only ones learning from the first tank battle. The Germans, initially stunned by the appearance of these mechanical monsters, quickly began developing countermeasures. Specialized artillery shells capable of penetrating tank armor were introduced, and defensive obstacles were reinforced to impede the tank's progress. Machine gun crews were trained to target the vulnerable tracks of the tanks, aiming to immobilize them and render them useless. The Germans also began experimenting with their own designs for armored vehicles, though these efforts lagged behind the British and French advancements. By 1917, the stage was set for the next major test of tank warfare, the Battle of Cambrai. This time, the tanks would not be a small, experimental force but the centerpiece of a carefully planned offensive. The British assembled nearly 400 tanks, including the improved Mark IV models, and coordinated their deployment with a massive artillery barrage and infantry assault. The attack began on November 20, 1917, and its initial success was staggering. The tanks rolled across the German lines, crushing barbed wire and traversing trenches with ease. The element of surprise, combined with the sheer number of tanks, overwhelmed the German defenders. Entire sections of the front collapsed, and the British made significant gains in a matter of hours. However, the limitations of the tanks and their supporting forces soon became apparent. The initial breakthroughs were not adequately reinforced, allowing the Germans to regroup and launch counterattacks. Many tanks were lost to mechanical failures, and others fell victim to artillery fire. The British advance stalled, and by the end of the battle, much of the ground gained had been lost. Still, the Battle of Cambrai was a turning point. It demonstrated the potential of tanks when used in large numbers and with proper coordination. The lessons from Cambrai would shape the future of armored warfare, laying the groundwork for the tactics and strategies that would dominate the next world war. For the soldiers who operated the tanks, the experience remained grueling. Despite improvements in design, the conditions inside the machines were still harsh. The noise, heat, and fumes were a constant challenge, and the crews often worked to the point of exhaustion. Many tank operators viewed their machines with a mix of pride and frustration. They understood the importance of their role in breaking the stalemate of trench warfare, but they also knew the risks they faced every time they climbed inside the steel hulls. The impact of the early tank battles extended far beyond the battlefield. The appearance of these machines marked the beginning of a new era in military technology. They were a symbol of industrial innovation, a testament to humanity's ability to adapt and overcome even the most daunting challenges. At the same time, they foreshadowed the mechanized conflicts that would come to define the 20th century. The tank was no longer just a weapon, it was a harbinger of the future, a tool that would shape the course of history in ways that few could have imagined. As the war continued, the tank evolved rapidly. Each battle brought new insights, new challenges, and new solutions. Engineers worked tirelessly to improve the machines, while military leaders refined their tactics to make the most of this powerful new weapon. By the time the war ended in 1918, tanks had become an integral part of modern warfare. They had proven their worth, not only as instruments of destruction but as symbols of resilience and ingenuity. The terror and awe they inspired on the battlefield were matched only by the hope they represented for breaking the deadlock of war and paving the way for a new kind of conflict. By the end of the First World War, the tank had cemented itself as a revolutionary weapon of modern warfare. Its first faltering steps on the battlefield had given way to a newfound understanding of its potential, and while the early models were far from perfect, they had opened the door to a new kind of conflict. The legacy of these first tanks was one of innovation, resilience, and a determination to break through the barriers of the old ways of war. The Mark I and its successors were born out of desperation, a response to the brutal stalemate of trench warfare. They represented a marriage of industrial ingenuity and military necessity, a rare convergence of vision and practicality that changed the battlefield forever. The sight of a tank advancing across no man's land, impervious to bullets and barbed wire, was enough to strike fear into the hearts of defenders who had never encountered such a machine. It was this psychological impact that often proved as decisive as the tank's physical capabilities. As the war ended and the dust settled, military thinkers around the world began to study the lessons of the tank. In Britain, engineers and strategists pored over the data from battles like Fles-Courcelette and Cambrai, analyzing what had worked and what had not. They recognized that while the tanks of World War I were groundbreaking, they were also deeply flawed. Slow, mechanically unreliable, and vulnerable to artillery, they were still far from the ideal war machines that their creators envisioned. The interwar years saw a flurry of development as nations sought to refine and improve the tank. In Britain, engineers worked on creating faster, more reliable models, experimenting with new designs and technologies. The Mark IV and later models laid the groundwork for the interwar tanks that would be used during World War II. Across the Channel, France and Germany also began developing their own tanks, each drawing on the lessons of the Great War. The German military, though initially limited by the Treaty of Versailles, secretly pursued tank development under the guise of agricultural vehicles, setting the stage for the blitzkrieg tactics that would later shock the world. In the United States, the lessons of World War I spurred the development of more versatile and heavily armed tanks. American engineers focused on creating machines that could operate effectively in diverse terrains, from the muddy battlefields of Europe to the deserts of North Africa. These advancements in tank design were complemented by a growing understanding of how to use tanks in combination with other military assets. By the 1930s, the concept of armored divisions had emerged, with tanks serving as the spearhead of highly mobile and coordinated operations. The legacy of the first tanks was not confined to their technological evolution. They also had a profound impact on military strategy and doctrine. The Great War had shown that traditional tactics were no match for the industrialized nature of modern conflict. The tank was a symbol of the shift from static, defensive warfare to a more dynamic, offensive approach. It embodied the idea that technology could overcome even the most entrenched obstacles, a lesson that resonated far beyond the battlefield. For the men who operated the first tanks, the experience was unforgettable. They were pioneers in a new form of warfare, enduring unimaginable hardships to prove the worth of their machines. Inside the cramped, stifling interiors of the Mark I, these crews faced not only the dangers of enemy fire but also the challenges of their own equipment. Yet their courage and perseverance laid the foundation for the tank crews of the future, who would take their place in history as the vanguard of armored warfare. The psychological impact of tanks extended beyond the soldiers who faced them in battle. Civilians, too, were struck by the sight of these mechanical beasts. Propaganda often depicted tanks as symbols of power and progress, machines that embodied the might of their respective nations. This image persisted long after the war, influencing public perceptions of military technology and its role in society. Tanks became icons of industrial strength, their presence a reminder of humanity's capacity to innovate in the face of adversity. The end of World War I did not mark the end of the tank's story. Instead, it was just the beginning. The interwar years saw the tank evolve into a cornerstone of military strategy, its design refined and its role expanded. By the time World War II began, tanks had become central to the doctrine of every major power, their capabilities transforming the nature of conflict once again. The blitzkrieg tactics of Germany, the armored divisions of the Allies, and the massive tank battles on the Eastern Front all bore the mark of the lessons learned from the first tanks of World War I. The legacy of those early machines is one of constant evolution. From the slow, clumsy Mark I to the fearsome tanks of World War II and beyond, the concept of the tank has continued to adapt to the changing face of warfare. Today, tanks remain a vital part of modern militaries, their designs incorporating cutting-edge technologies that would have been unimaginable to the engineers of the Great War. The first tanks were far from perfect, but they represented a turning point in the history of warfare. They were a response to the horrors of trench combat, a bold attempt to break the deadlock and bring mobility back to the battlefield. Their legacy is not just one of metal and machinery, but of the human spirit, the drive to innovate, to overcome, and to push the boundaries of what is possible. The terror and mettle of those early tanks laid the groundwork for a century of armored warfare, a testament to the power of invention in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges.